Hi, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me into the family. It's great to be here. What I thought I'd do is give you sort of an outline of how we think about behavioral science these days and how it might help you think about the work you do, and particularly the perspective of the client. When your work depends on what people do, whether you're doing financial access or driving a taxi or teaching a classroom, if your outcome depends on what people do, it's important to understand what they're doing, what drives them, how they perceive the situation, how they think about what it is you're presenting them with. And there's an old quote that talks about how you can either try to understand the psychology or you can make up your own, and it's going to be bad psychology. I have a beautiful collection of bad psychology, so if we have time, I can give you some descriptions later. But what does it mean to do good psychology? So I want to give you a couple of basic principles, and from where I'm concerned, these are principles about information processing, about attention, about perception, about how people approach a decision scene. So, for example, culture makes a difference, a contextual difference in the nuances, but the stuff I want to present you with, it doesn't depend on what passport you hold. It's sort of, the machinery that we hold behind the eyes and between the ears. That's what I want to try to give you a sense for. And probably two of the main principles that come when you think about that machinery is construal and context. Construal is the thing that I see when I process a scene. Now, there is a fact that I always try to emphasize. I don't want this to sound sophisticated. This is not postmodernism. It's profoundly trivial, but we tend not to think about it. When I give you a choice between A and B, it could be two bank accounts, it could be two cars, it could be two spouses, it could be two cities in which you live. What you're choosing between are not A and B. What you're choosing between are A and B as they are represented in the machinery in the head. Now, it's obvious, but it has enormous implications. All of economic theorizing, when we talk about choosing between A and B, it's an incredibly courageous step to make because we're assuming people are choosing between the things out there as they are. But of course, that's not what's going on. People are choosing between things out there as they are conceiving of them, as they're conceptualizing them. So this issue of construal is profound. And in research, it's been shown to have big effects. If you've seen any visual illusion, all of you have seen visual illusions before, which are kind of fun to look at. What's happening there is there's something in the world which is not what you're seeing. You're seeing something different. That's because of the way our visual processing works. The rest of our processing looks very similar. There are things out there, and we're seeing something that's not the same. It's not a copy. It's not a summary. It's a construed representation, which will be quite different. If you do studies on how people play prisoner dilemma games, I don't know how many of you know all this data, but it's basically these are nice games that kind of see to what extent I'm cooperative or selfish. There have been beautiful studies where you take students and have them play prisoner dilemma games, and you construct the game to be identical. The only thing you change is the description of the game. In one case, subjects are invited to play the community game, and then everything else is the same. In another condition, they're invited to play the Wall Street game, and everything else is the same. And they don't behave the same. So you've kept the rewards, the incentives, everything, the payoffs, all identical. You've changed the name. I bring with me all the baggage that's associated with community versus Wall Street, and I play like a different person. If you call people during a commute and ask them, what car are you driving? And then you look at, and then how fun is the commute today? What you find is that people who drive BMWs are enjoying their commute more than people who are driving Ford Escorts. Now you do it again. This time when I call you, instead of saying, what car are you driving and how is the ride today? I say, good morning, how is your ride today? And by the way, what car are you driving? Now you get no difference between BMWs and Escorts. If I haven't thought about the fact that I'm in a Beamer, I enjoy just as much as somebody in a little Jalopy. If you reminded me that I'm driving a BMW, I respond to it. Notice, first of all, of course, if you're BMW, you now want to have a little gadget that every 10 minutes says you're driving a BMW. But more importantly, what people are construed, this is an everyday commute. The actual pleasure they derive, it's the same car, it's what comes to mind. And that has an enormous implication for many aspects of our everyday lives. When it comes, for example, to identity threat, to stereotypes, to how people feel about themselves, that can have an enormous impact. It's the same person, it's the same situation. There's beautiful work, I don't know if you've seen it, for example, on stereotype threat in schools. African-American kids in American schools have a stereotype threat. They are living in a context where if you're black, you're supposed to be less successful in academics. And that stereotype, think about it like a noise in the head, like a weight on the shoulder, that affects their performance. And there have been fantastic studies where you go in and convince the kids, just tell them the next task you're doing has been shown to have no racial differences in performance. Or you affirm them, you make them do things where African Americans excel. And it's remarkable, within 3 days you lose the black-white differences. In fact, in many of these studies, the African Americans do better than the whites. All it has to do is how I'm conceiving of myself, my internal construal, and the performance that it yields. So that's construal. These are all cases where it's just my representation of the case, what car I'm driving, what game I'm playing, who I am in school, that alters what I do. The second is context, it's a situation. The context has an enormous impact on us. We all know there's a little bit of it, but the effect of context, the power it has, is way more than we appreciate. So the lesson, if you take an advanced social psych course, is that context has an enormous impact, and we tend not to get it, we discount it. Many of you have seen studies like Milgram's experiments, where people give electric shocks. There was a slew of studies that came, particularly in the US after the Second World War, where a bunch of European psychologists who escaped Europe were sort of obsessed with understanding, what made the German mind do the things that it did. They ran a battery of studies. Of course, there's nothing German about the German mind. This is the mind all of us carry around with us. And what they discover is kind of stunning. So one of the famous studies is Stanley Milgram's studies at the basement of the Yale psychology department. He brings middle-aged men into the department. They're supposed to play this game where they're the teachers and there's a student. The student happens to be a Confederate. He's an actor. He's working for the experimenter. He gets attached to electrodes. And then you ask me silly questions, and every time if a student makes a mistake, you give them a slight electric shock, which gets progressively higher as we proceed. There's this fancy machine, it goes to 450 volts, triple X danger. And the question is, will anybody do this? And what's beautiful in Milgram's work is that he actually had the wisdom to interview people before and say, this is a study. He gave them all the details. What's your prediction? And nobody predicts that anybody will go above about 150 volts. That's when the grunts by the student gets loud. Except for the psychiatrists he interviews. This is in Northeast America, 1970. The psychiatrists recognize that 1 in 1,000 will be a sociopath and will go up to 450. What Milgram finds is that 65% of his subjects, these are respectable men in New Haven, are sociopaths, and that everybody goes above 300. If you look at his correspondence with the NIH, you realize this is a new lesson about the human condition. I mean, he is an expert in human behavior. His plan, of course, was to show the opposite. It was to show that U.S. independence is nothing like Germany. He's discussing this with the NIH, and he's blown away. He never expected to find this. So what we know is we never understood it before. It's something that it's very hard for us to internalize. Most of us, when we open the paper and read about Abu Ghraib, we think these are not very nice people. It's very hard for us to understand these are perfectly reasonable people in a terrible situation, that most of us, unfortunately, would look similar. Hard for us, hard for me, hard for you to believe. There's a contextual effect that's very powerful that we tend to not appreciate. Of course, that context doesn't need electrocutions. It happens in department stores, it happens in classrooms, it happens here. And it has an enormous impact that we fail to recognize. And it, by the way, gives you enormous power because you're in the business of shaping people's contexts. And what's so interesting, what comes up out of that, is that if you recognize how that context functions and where the faults, where the obstacles, where the glitches are, you're in a position to often alter it in pretty benign ways that can make a big difference. Context effects are of all sorts. The very simple one I'll give you is something like the default effect. It's a very powerful effect. What is the default if people fail to act? There's a fantastic study of European countries. If you look at people's being organ donors, willing organ donors in different European countries, it's a beautiful study that was published in Science. 6 countries in Europe average 94% organ donors among drivers. The other 5 countries average 14%. 94 and 14, you look at it, you have Austria on one side, Germany on the other, the Netherlands on one side, Belgium on the other. What's doing? What's doing is in the 94% countries, you're a donor unless you opt out. In the 14% countries, you're not a donor unless you opt in. Now, the transaction cost in almost all these cases is signing the back of your license, pretty small stuff. We're not talking about buying orange juice. This is, your religious beliefs, your cultural norms, your values, your family. And you have a completely different country in which people live based on this tiny nuance, which we know lawyers in those countries did not appreciate. We know that because the day this article comes up, some countries wake up in the morning and change the default. And we know that it turns out, for example, that most people in all of these countries would rather live in the countries where there's 94% than 14. So as a responsible, behaviorally informed policymaker, you owe people to default them into being donors with a complete freedom to opt out rather than the opposite. Okay, so in examples like these, where the context, it's a tweak, nobody takes it seriously, but has an enormous impact on people, ends up having enormous consequences, sometimes intentional, where you manipulate people, very often sort of naive without really knowing where it's going. One of the main issues, if you look at sort of behavioral psychological life, is our limited bandwidth. One reason all this is going on is because we don't have too much time and mental apparatus and mental cognitive capacity to stop and think about this carefully. Think about us as, automatic pilots. I get a driver's license, I'm an organ donor, somebody tells me I can switch, I say, thank you very much, I'll talk to friends about this, I move on, I never think about it again, and that's it. I don't know how many of you, checked your car insurance. Is this the best one you could have? You chose one 37 years ago, you never looked at it again. Most likely there are much better ones out there, all of us recognize it, and life moves on. This limited bandwidth has an enormous implications on us. Now, there are studies on driving with cell phones, for example. Recent studies that are really quite remarkable. Forget handhelds. Everybody understands that you need two hands to hold the wheel, so forget that. Non-handheld, you're speaking on a cell phone, no hands, what happens? They've done studies in simulators. When you're in the car, on the cell phone, hands-free, your reaction time and your ability to detect the periphery look like somebody who's legally drunk in the US. Now, this is not cognitively, we don't understand that. I mean, you hear it, I tell you this, all of us are going to get into the car and get on the cell phone again because we think we can beat the odds, but we have very limited bandwidths. And there are remarkable studies where you get me busy on a cell phone and there's a clown on a unicycle going through the room and we don't notice it. It's phenomenal. This happens to be a big challenge to all of us, and it's particularly a big challenge for the poor. Because it turns out when you're struggling with insufficient resources, this is a main theme of our book on scarcity, you're in constant juggling mode. There's a lot you need to do on a daily basis just to manage your daily life. And when you're spending a lot of your bandwidth juggling your everyday life, your finances, there is just less mind left for other things. Among them, things that are very relevant to your financial life, just like your car insurance. And that ends up being a very powerful effect. I'll give you one study of a series that we ran. We're going to people in a shopping mall in New Jersey. We ask them to participate in the study. They sit down in front of a computer. We're going to give you scenarios from everyday life, financial difficulties, like your car breaks down, it's going to cost X dollars to fix. And while you're thinking about these scenarios, just to make things interesting, we're going to let you play some games on the computer. These games end up being classic cognitive tests that have been used for years of divided attention and fluid intelligence. It's a component of the IQ test. So people sit down, think about these scenarios, play these games, and then they tell us how they're going to solve the problem. The scenarios come in two versions, called the manageable and challenging. The manageable case, the car is going to cost $150 to fix, which we know for most people in this New Jersey mall is manageable. The challenging case, the car is going to cost $1,500 to fix, which we know for about half the people in the mall is a giant challenge financially. So you sit down, you do all this, and you play these games. We divide them later by household income into poor and rich. And what do? If you look at the rich in the mall, when they're worried about the $150 car or the $1,500 car, they perform equally well on their divided attention and their IQ, no difference. When you look at the poor in the mall, when they're worried about the $150 car, which is manageable, they look statistically identical to the rich, no difference. But when the poor are worried about the $1,500 car, their divided attention goes way down, and their fluid intelligence, their IQ score goes down. It goes down by nearly a standard deviation, by some assumptions about this distribution of IQ points. These people who a minute ago were just as good as their rich friends are now performing at about 13 IQ points lower. 13 IQ points in a school in New Jersey where my kids go to school On a qualitative scale, that takes you from average to borderline gifted or from average to borderline deficient. It's a big effect. We know, for example, from studies, that if I kept you up all night, all night like with Rolling Stones blasting in the background, you'll be today about 9 IQ points less successful this morning in this session. So think about how you feel about a night without sleep. These guys, when scarcity challenges impose their ugly head, are feeling worse than you do after a night without sleep. And this issue of financial challenges and impact on their performance, I think is really central to how we think about challenges of poverty, because if you take together the fact that context can make a big difference, and that juggling challenges impact my performance and my IQ, that suggests that if you design the right contexts that make my juggling easier, you'll have given me a bandwidth gift. You'll have given me IQ points, because I'm spending less of my time, less of my mind on stuff that burns my juggling, on worries about food for Monday and rent for Friday, and I have more mind left to do other things that are relevant to my everyday life. And that is important because, again, because the contextual tweaks are so easy to manipulate, you can do simple things that have a big effect. What are those things? FAFSA, for example, is the most generous benefits program that the US government gives today. It's money to go to college for low-income kids. It's tens of thousands of dollars. Take-up is a third of eligibles. Only about a third of eligible students pick up FAFSA, which of course has lifetime of implications and consequences for them. They did a study where they go to people who are eligible for FAFSA and they said, I know everything about you. I've checked your income, your household income. I know everything. You are eligible for tens of thousands of dollars of FAFSA. Here is the form. Take-up is the same as before. Next version, I know everything about you, your parents' income. You're eligible for FAFSA. Here is the form. Let's fill it out together. That creates a 25% increase in matriculation, even more in applications. It turns out that just filling out a stupid form when my life is complicated, I don't have a reading ability challenge. Just managing time and having the guts to do it makes a big difference. This is something you think about because the money you pay for people to fill out the form is much less than the US government has spent trying to convince people to apply for FAFSA. We went to a soup kitchen in Princeton where people have this identity threat. Just like the African-American kids have an identity threat, the poor, universally, there's remarkable studies on these. There are places in the world where it's not so good to be a woman or Roma or Jewish or black. Poor, internationally, anywhere you go, the poor and the homeless are on the bottom left of the multidimensional scale. They're untrustworthy, unreliable, unclean, etc. And the poor know it. That's the stereotype they walk around with. What we did in the soup kitchen in Trenton, in New Jersey, is half of them are in the control, the other half we affirm. We make them feel good about themselves. We asked them to describe a recent case where they felt capable and proud. And then we put benefits packages, VITA sites, EITC, different benefits for which these people might be eligible, in little government-issued booklets on the way out of the soup kitchen. And we simply see how many of them have the guts, the gumption to take up this somewhat threatening booklet as they leave. And those in the soup kitchen who have been affirmed, a simple 60-second interview about making you feel better about yourself, are 3 times more likely to walk out of the soup kitchen with a benefits package. Now, I have no illusion they're going to fill it out because the minute they step out, America is there waiting. But for a moment, you're showing that how I feel about myself, which could be easily manipulated, has an impact on what I do, the courage I exhibit, my actual cognitive capacity, and my reliance on, for example, things like benefits and other things. We did another one with Shore Bank in Chicago where people come out for help for their taxes. We take all those who are unbanked and tell them there's a bank uptown, a Shore Bank in northern Chicago, where they can open very beneficial and subsidized accounts. Again, half of them are told about it. The other half are told about it and told there's a person there in the corner you can start the process with. You still have to go uptown to Shore Bank, so the transaction cost is kept the same. But instead of just keeping it in mind, you're starting the process now and leave with a form half filled. And that has impact on their take-up of the account. So these are all small manipulations that can have a big effect on how people think. And there's a lot more to be done. I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that come out of not getting it, including on employers, for example, in whose self-interest it might be to understand it. I'll give you one example. If you work for McDonald's in the US today, you typically get your schedule 48 to 72 hours in advance. You're told when are you going to work on Friday, when are you going to work on Monday, etc. If you're a single mom with kids at home and work for McDonald's and you're told 2 or 3 days in advance what hours you work, you're in constant, incessant, never-ending child care management mode. You constantly have to worry who's going to be with the kids in 3 days. If McDonald's gave you the working hours for 2 weeks in advance, I suspect that we'll have workers who sleep better, who are worried less, who make less mistakes on the job. It will be completely self-serving. And I don't think it's impossible to do, but we fail to appreciate the impact that this might have on our workers and our people's bandwidth in ways that could really help. And by the way, in the book, we talk about a lot about the following fact. Many people in this room are time poor in ways that are very similar to the way that our subjects are money poor. We're not going to get into details here, but one thing that happens with the poor, for example, is you're constantly doing trade-offs. Everything you do, when you buy a cup of coffee, when you go to have lunch, you ask yourself, what will I not buy instead? Many people in this room don't feel that way about money, but you do about time. And so if you think about time management, we are getting enormous help with our time management. We have reminders, and we have people who are doing things for us, and we delegate and relegate and do all kinds of things to give us more time. The poor, who in some sense need it the most, until you guys came on the scene, are getting the least help. And in some sense, there's a real challenge and a real place to interfere in the contextual design of the lives of the poor and simply make the juggling easier and the bandwidth a bit more open. I'll leave you with one last thought, then we'll have a conversation. It has to do with evaluation. When you try to evaluate a program, there's something interesting going on. If the Treasury Department introduces a new financial instrument, what do? Let's assume you have a nice controlled experiment. Some people get it, some people don't. We'll go back 2 years later and see how are those who receive this new financial instrument, how are they doing financially? Is it helping them? Go back a step and think about this very limited bandwidth I'm telling you. This is a very limited bandwidth that we have, and it's the only one we've got. This is the bandwidth that I need in order to do my finances, remember to take my medication on time, eat healthy, pay attention to my kids' homework. It's the one I have. When you give me a bandwidth gift, when you make my banking easier, one very reasonable thing for me to say would be, thank you so much. Now I have to devote less bandwidth to banking. Let me spend more time on my kids' homework. From an evaluation perspective, what happens then is you give me a financial instrument, and where you ought to go and see how my kids are doing in school, not how I'm doing on banking. And so what this suggests is if you give me help somewhere and go back and see how I'm doing there, you might miss something really important, which is now that you helped me there, I say, thank you, I need to pay less attention to it. Let me do better in my life elsewhere. And from an evaluation perspective, that really changes a bit the metric of how we ought to think about gauging how much help and how much benefits we're giving those who we're helping. I think I want to stop here and let's have a conversation. Is that okay? Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I have a disclaimer, which is that my IQ is at least 8 or 9% or points lower than it would have been normally because I woke up at 3:30 in the morning and watched the debate live feed. So it's probably actually more than 9 IQ points lower, but so forgive me for that. So I had the great pleasure of reading Eldar's book, Scarcity, over the last couple of weeks, and I found it an incredibly useful tool. And I think one of the things that's so powerful about it is that it speaks to multiple contexts. So you talk about time, you talk about money poverty, you even talk about scarcity of calories and people who are dieting. And so anybody who reads it can immediately kind of relate to it. And so for me, obviously the time scarcity was the most powerful kind of context for my life. And you introduce a few concepts that I think are really helpful in thinking about how we serve our clients in the financial sector. So this idea of tunneling. So you have to get something done. You don't have time, so you just focus on that task. And everything outside of that tunnel doesn't exist. And you just focus on getting that done. But then that leads to juggling. And you're having to juggle multiple tasks, and you go from one crisis to the next. And you give lots and lots of examples of that. And I think it's a really helpful way for people to think about some of the constraints that the poor face. But the other, I think, interesting issue that you raise in the book is that all of this applies to the poor, but the poor have one really fundamental difference from people like me and the people in this audience, which is there's nowhere to go. They don't have kind of the slack or the discretion to be able to manage that constraint in the same way that we can. So I can always find ways to manage my time shortage. Whether I do it or not is a different question, but the poor really are limited in what they can do. So kind of bringing your behavioral insights into this room and into the financial services context, I'm wondering if you can just give us some insights into how financial services providers can identify that bandwidth tax that's faced by their customers and use that to design products or services that take that into account and help the poor in terms of managing their bandwidth. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll pick up from the point you made earlier, which I did not cover. This is an issue of how you on time might be different from the poor on money, for example, and it's an important one. So there's two things to say. First of all, obviously, when we are working very hard, there are weekends and there's Christmas vacation. The poor rarely take vacation from poverty, so in that sense, it's really different. The other one, we describe in a book a very touching study apropos of limited bandwidth in a school in Connecticut, where by random assignment, this is a study done by some sociologists 20 years ago, by random assignment, half the kids are assigned to a class, to a room that's in a quiet side of the school, and the other half are in the side of the school very near the train tracks. So on an occasional basis throughout the day, a train goes out the window. And the question is this distracting? Sure, it's distracting. How distracting is it? They discover that in 5th grade, the kids near the trains are 1 year behind in academic performance relative to those on the quiet side. They then install soundproofing and the kids catch up. It's a remarkable effect. I'm telling you this because the metaphor we use is, imagine yourself now in a very quiet room, no distractions, you're trying to do something, and there are these internal trains. There's worries about money for rent or food. Those internal trains could be just like the trains outside the window. And again, what's interesting, for many of us who are dealing with scarce resources, the things are not pressing enough so that we're not able for an hour in this room to say, let me leave those alone, I'll participate in an interesting conversation, think about them later. Turns out, if things are pressing enough, if you left home a kid who was very sick, if you had a big fight with your partner an hour ago, then you can't do that. Then you're actually less smart today in this room. These trains, you can't control them. And what turns out to be in the life of the poor is that. There's these trains that go through that I cannot put out of sight, out of mind. And that really interferes. Now, what does it mean for you? You're not going to stop those trains. But it means there's a lot that can be done for, among other things, for example, how do you shape the context to allow me to do the right things at the right time? To be obvious, you want to sell me fertilizer, not when I need it and I'm out of cash, but earlier in the season when I have cash to pay for it, even if I don't use it for another 6 months. All else equal, there's a lot of beautiful work on intention versus action. The fact that you see me not buying fertilizer certainly should not be interpreted as showing that I'm not interested or don't understand it. I might just be cash constrained right now. I'm so worried about rent, I don't have time for fertilizer. But if you catch me at a time when I'm liquidity less constrained, I might do a lot better. So a lot of it comes down, and Ideas 42, this organization that was mentioned, spends a lot of time. When you see behavior that's not the way you'd like it to be, you need to make sure people have the intention. If they haven't understood that it's important to eat healthy or take the medication, all bets are off. But once they understand it, you want to find what are the obstacles? How do I approach them at the right moment, at the right time, with the right frame, and the right context to facilitate implementing the things that we actually have good reason to think they would like to do, all else being equal?
Yeah. Well, and I think this idea of giving people slack, right? So you talk about this a lot in the book as well. So people have constraints, they have scarcity and abundance, and kind of managing against that. For the poor, it's more scarcity than abundance. But I was really intrigued by the experiment that you did with Dean Carlin at the Coyambedu market in Chennai. So vendors were borrowing working capital every day, and this was effectively reducing their income by half, right? So you guys gave, I think, 1,000 rupees to each of these vendors so that they didn't have to borrow. So they sort of had a bit of slack in the system. But shocks during the course of the year took their toll, and that savings essentially disappeared. And so by the end of the year, every single one of those vendors was back into the borrowing cycle, and so unable to kind of manage that slack. So as we think about providing financial tools for the poor, how can we think about ways to build that kind of mental slack into their ability to manage their resources so that shocks don't tip them back into a harmful cycle?
Right, so it's a super interesting. So, we came to this study slightly from a different place where we weren't thinking about these issues per se, but when you see these incredibly hardworking women borrow every morning, make 100 rupees, go and pay back the lender 50 rupees at the end of the day, basically making half of what they could have. There's a real question, are they just planning badly? Why are they doing this? It looks silly for 15 years to make half of what you could every single day. So the question was, let's render them debt-free. So now they don't have to borrow every time they make 100 rupees. Since they didn't borrow anything this morning and have nobody to give 50 back to, they keep the entire 100. They would literally double their income overnight. And then basically there's two theories. One is these people are not thoughtful enough and self-controlled enough to do it right, or something else. And as Greta mentioned, they clearly persisted long enough to be very clear they're not just splurging. They're very thoughtful, very careful. They were living a better life with twice as much income. But they were not rich. They were not saving. They were just living better. And then things happen. Medical emergency, a big wedding, something that led them to borrow again, and one by one they fell. Somewhere between 6 months and a year, they ended up borrowing again and went back to where they were before we came. And now the question comes, and it's exactly the right question, how do you form, now that life is a bit better, how do you create the right slack so as to live a longer and better life? Look, this is a problem all of us have. I mean, a lot of my colleagues are not saving enough for retirement. It's a similar story. You have the money now, but instead of putting it aside for later, you're using too much of it, and when something comes up, you don't have enough. And so this is a problem all of us have. And again, one reason my retirement will look better is not because I'm thoughtful and planning, is because somebody who pays my salary is taking care of a lot of it. In fact, they went further and defaulted me into more than the government requires because they're wise and they knew I could afford it. So a lot of it now comes to, how do you design exactly those features? Take payday loans, which are an extreme example. In the US today, people take incredibly high-cost, low-term, high-interest loans. Imagine if every time you take a payday loan and then come back and pay me 600 APR after 2 weeks. Imagine if now we had a system where every time you pay me back, I take 10% of it and put it into a savings account for you. Basically, after 10 loans, you don't have to take a loan again. These are kinds of things that non-for-profits and governments could design so that even if I'm functioning at real poverty level, after a while we've created some slack, some savings. It doesn't depend on me getting up in the morning and with an overwhelmed bandwidth deciding to do something exotic, but you design a context where it just happens to me and I'm thoughtful enough to accept it and not resist it, and life gets better. That's kind of the challenge, I think. I'm reluctant to give exact proposals because, of course, depending where you are, who the people are, it's going to differ enormously. The research we did in Chennai, not on the food vendors, but on farmers, for example, we worked a lot with sugarcane farmers because their income comes in one shot, once a year during harvest. It's a very different set of challenges than people who get paid daily like the food vendors. So, of course, that will differ how you solve it. But the approach, the intuition is the same. These are people who are understanding, thoughtful, interested enough to do it. Life presents very complicated challenges. And I think many of you are in a position to just lower the weight of those challenges and give me what behavioral scientists call channel factors, just channels that make it easier for me to get to the right place.
Yeah, and before we came in here, we were speaking with Rose Goslinga, in fact, about how you can incorporate very tiny tweaks into things that change those behaviors and just make it easier for people to kind of default to a mode that makes more sense for them. One of the other intriguing things in your book is not just talking about poor customers and how we can use these insights for poor customers, but you also talk about, for example, a hospital or a couple of restaurants and how providers can manage scarcity to manage their resources better. Have you given any thought to how financial services providers can also kind of think about scarcity of their resources, and particularly, the microfinance community is very labor intensive, and are there ways that we can apply these insights to the supply side on the financial services?
Yes, I mean, the example Greta describes is kind of a stunning example we came across as a hospital that doesn't have enough rooms for all the operations, all the surgeries, and they're totally overwhelmed. They bring an expert, and the expert studies this and says, okay, you leave one room empty just for emergencies. And the hospital says, no, you don't understand, we don't have enough rooms. And the expert says, no, I do understand, you leave one room empty for emergencies. And it turns out that having this room empty for emergencies so that all the other rooms can be planned throughout the day without emergencies interfering makes an enormous difference to this hospital's future. Everything gets a lot easier than managing emergencies and planned operations all together in the same rooms. It's a little bit like saving for a rainy day. All of us we talk a lot about our clients making mistakes. It's remarkable to me how bad we are in saving for a rainy day in our time management. What do I mean? Many of you now, if you look at a calendar, on a normal workday, have a scheduled meeting at 9, and then at 10, and at 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, I guarantee you, something unexpected is expected to happen during that day. There is a phone call, there is an email, there's a reminder that you forgot something. Why didn't you plan for that? So I always insist that studying this stuff does not make me any better. I'm just as culpable and silly about stuff as anybody. But this one I learned. I actually plan 1 or 2 half-hour chunks throughout the day empty. And it's a fantastic, this is saving, just like your clients should leave for a medical emergency, you need to leave every day for that unexpected reminder of something you forgot, or a phone call or an email. And it makes an enormous difference. Now, because people don't understand it, it's kind of interesting. If I leave half an hour empty at 11, and Greta comes and says, can we meet at 11? I say, sorry, I want to be by myself. That just sounds bizarre. But I can say, sorry, I have a meeting. You know, she doesn't know it's meeting with self. So I call it meeting with self. You schedule for yourself 1 or 2 meetings with self throughout the day, and your day will get so much easier. And things of that sort, time management. I'll give you another example. You have a very important meeting at 11. You're a diligent and responsible person. You show up at 10 to 11. You have 10 minutes to kill. Perfect. Let's do a few emails. Terrible. Because in those 2 emails that you efficiently cover, there's going to be 1 or 2 that are going to take away from your bandwidth during the important meeting you're scheduling. Because now you walk into this meeting and you're worried about the email you just saw. Terrible planning if you take seriously your limited attention. You get to the meeting early, think about the meeting, 100 times more effective. Now again, you know, depending on what you do, the insights will come in different places, but taking seriously the fact that you have limited attention, time management issues, and how you might juggle these things, I think makes you a tiny bit happier.
I think you just described the story of my life. I closed the door, that helps. But
I was going to say, by the way, I also watched the debate at 3:30 this morning. But my interpretation is it shows low IQ when we started, not when we finished.
It just seems to be getting lower every week.
Right.
I don't know. So turning more to the kind of policy sphere, CGAP's worked with you and Ideas 42 on incorporating some of these behavioral insights into policy making. And so switching from kind of the private sector provision of financial services and the constraints on the poor, what are some ways that policymakers can practically think about applying these insights into their work, you know, particularly around things like financial education, consumer protection, but in any context?
I think the entire Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I don't know how much people know about this in the US, Elizabeth Warren's baby, is driven by behavioral understanding and recognition of the fact that people are terribly limited. We, for many years, had the following kind of findings. If you tell somebody you have $1,000 credit card debt at 18% and you pay the minimum fee, how long will it take you to pay the debt? And people say, 1.5 years, and the answer is 90 years. I mean, we were just off by a factor of 110. It was amazing. People just have terrible intuition about compounding. And finally, after many, many years, the Obama administration introduced what's known in the US as a Schumer box. But basically, when you get your credit card bill, they're now obligated by law to tell you how much you owe, what the minimum fee is, and how long it will take you to pay that minimum fee if you stick to the minimum fee. So they're telling you it's not 1.5 years, it's 90. That's now part of the law. And I think that's useful because it's just something people do, it's almost a visual illusion. You just don't see it correctly. So the question is, what do you do with that? I think consumer protection is one very important area. People just don't understand. This stuff is complicated. It's, by the way, unbelievably boring. Nobody really cares, and they just make terrible mistakes. And it's just like you defend people against using a blender that's dangerous. You need to defend them against using financial instruments that are bad for them, not even talking about ballooning mortgages. So I think this is a big step in a good direction. There's many other areas in our financial lives where policymakers can make a difference. A lot of it, of course, depends on the willingness of having government interfere. In the US, obviously, it's very extreme, much more than Europe, but the reluctance to have government interference. To the extent that you can do it, many small tweaks of this sort can really make things a lot better in ways that, I think we're seeing a little bit more every day, whether it's health or other areas where we're forcing people to do something that is good for them. With a recognition, obviously, we don't want to get government too involved. I mean, there's always the Orwell in the background, but up to a point, it makes a lot of sense to have experts help you.
I loved your example in the book about people not taking their medicine, and somebody had designed bottle caps that sort of went off with increasing intensity of light, and then they started making noise so that people would remember to take their. I need to get one of those.
That's right.
Last question, and kind of leads into the panel that we'll have a little bit later today, and I think it's a relevant question for a lot of people in this room, is a lot of people, particularly in providing financial services to very low-income people in Africa, are using data. And it's becoming a driver in the design of financial products for the poor. How can we use data to influence our thinking about the constraints faced by poor customers? So it's easy to kind of understand on a one-on-one basis what X person is facing, but are there ways that we can use kind of larger data sets to really understand some of these counterintuitive behaviors that might not be obvious on the face of things?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think big data can do a lot of things. The one that's the most intuitive to me, the most simple to me, is just big data is going to help you understand better and divide the world in kind of more nuanced categories into what matters to people's behavior in ways that are relevant. A lot of the findings are not intuitive. I'll give you one example that's totally outside the realm of finance. When you do police lineups, you have a suspect, you put 6 people in a lineup, and you have an eyewitness. It turns out that if the policeman or woman who's conducting the lineup knows which of the 6 is a suspect, the chance that that person out of the 6 will be identified is higher. Okay, again, you have a totally well-intentioned, there's no strategy, it's a very well-intentioned police person who knows which of the 6 is a suspect. Then the chance that that person will be identified is higher than if the policeman who conducts the lineup doesn't know which one of the 6 is a suspect. How does this happen? It's glances, it's pupils, it's aha. When Greta says, I think it's said when I say aha, I said that aha differently when I know than when I don't. She picks up on it. Nobody knows it's happened, but the data are very clear. This is data. You couldn't intuit it, you couldn't explain it, you couldn't predict it, and you can certainly never go to a police station and say your cops, although very well-intentioned, are interfering with the lineup. It's only data that allows you to go in and, when you walk into the police station and say this, the chief is very upset. She did not expect you to tell her this. But now that you have the data, in New Jersey, it's now the law that when the police person who runs the lineup is not allowed to know who the suspect is. Along those lines, there's going to be a lot of data in our world. When I tell you about African Americans in schools performing less well, that's a very rough division. There's many kinds of African Americans, there's many kinds of schools. There are African Americans with parents who are highly educated and wealthy, and there's other kinds. Obviously, big data is going to allow us to divide these categories into much more refined and sophisticated ways of carving the world that's relevant to us so as to produce the best outcomes.
Well, thank you very much for this. I am a huge fan of your book, and just to wrap up, I found this incredibly useful, and I would recommend it to anybody who's here. And I discovered through this that I'm sort of a serial victim of time scarcity, and I'm a master kind of juggler. So I think it's going to give me some really good insights into how to manage my time. But even better, I was able to use this book to convince my children to save. So I talked them into, last Sunday, receiving their allowances digitally into their bank accounts rather than getting it in cash, so that they won't spend it on fake things that don't exist in the real world, on a computer game or on sugary sweets. So it's a powerful enough book that it convinced not only me but my 2 children. So I would highly recommend it. No. Well, they haven't yet experienced the scarcity that's going to come from it. But the book is also really a fun read. So it features Family Feud, believe it or not, Benihana, NASA, and dieting. So I would highly recommend it to everybody here. It's a great read. So thank you very much.
Thank you.